to get back to where we were talking about, white privilege and the left's view that that America is inherently racist. All of you are racist, as you saw, and we know because people tell you that you're racist, right? They don't know you. They don't know anything about you. One of the gals over here, I turned off the mic so you couldn't hear the conversation. I said to her, she's the one who was shouting that you're all white supremacists. I said, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. How do you know I'm a white supremacist? And she said, well, that's the image you give off. And I said, really? Was it the yarmulke that did it for you? Now, before we talk about, the left's argument is basically that inequality between groups is inequity. If there's any sort of inequality between racial groups, that's because something has happened in the United States that is deeply unfair and is currently happening. Not just has happened in the past, but it's happening right now. We are all the beneficiaries of white privilege. We are all the purveyors and propagators, words they don't understand, of white privilege, right? Now, it is true, before we go any further, that black people in the United States have obviously suffered historic discrimination. Right? It's inarguably true. Of course that's true. It's even true that some people are likely suffering from the effects of historic discrimination under things like Jim Crow, but that does not mean that black people right now are suffering from institutional discrimination. And historic discrimination does not explain current levels of inequality. It certainly doesn't justify discrimination against white people who had nothing whatsoever to do with Jim Crow. Individuals all over America experience inequality. Some of us are born rich, some of us are born poor, some of us are born smart, some of us are born protesters. Right? Nobody is capable of righting wrongs done to people 3 generations ago by penalizing their great-grandchildren. You can't do that. The solution to historic injustice is not modern injustice. 3 generations ago, my people were being slaughtered by the millions in Europe, and FDR wouldn't let Jews into the country. That doesn't mean there's widespread anti-Jewish privilege throughout America that requires restitution from all of you. That's not how this works. We cannot fix where you started in life. We can't. That's beyond your control. That's beyond my control. But the notion of white privilege suggests you can never, under any circumstances, overcome where you started in life. Because there's this big bear called white privilege that's trying to eat you. That if you make even if you make all the right decisions, white privilege will stand in your way. That is a lie. But it is a lie that this campus obviously promotes. In 2013, the History Department created mandatory diversity training, giving out handouts on the re-education process, which sounds kind of Orwellian, needed for white people to overcome racist conditioning. This university has sponsored a multitude of events on white privilege and supported the lying Black Lives Matter movement. New freshmen are supposed to take diversity training where they learn, of course, about white privilege. As Katrina Morrison, a junior from Milwaukee, said last year, quote, "We wanted to talk about privilege. What is white privilege? What are the sets of privileges that we all have? It's okay that we have these different sets of privileges and identities and can still coexist." The new Our Wisconsin training program, which was initiated for the freshmen this year, it's going to cost about $200,000. And it includes students taking part in discussion groups, writing about their experiences, and practicing other mental exercises to help them realize their feelings toward other ethnicities. As you can see, this has been a wild success. In general, it turns out there's another reason that in a free country, some people fail and some people succeed. Some values, some behavior is better than other values and behavior. And people who tend to hold fast to better values do better than people who don't. Perhaps equality of opportunity only exists so long as people are willing to take advantage of those opportunities. And that's the truth. White privilege isn't reality. It's just a cowardly way to blame somebody else for your own failures to live up to decent standards. Whites are not born with a genetic predisposition to doing the right thing in some arbitrary moral system that benefits whites for doing the right thing. There are 3 simple life rules that will guarantee that you are not permanently poor in the United States, regardless of race, regardless of gender. Finish high school, get a job, get married before you have babies. That's it. And I guarantee you that everybody in this room and all the people outside are capable of this. Right? You've already finished high school. Everybody, even the poli-sci majors, will eventually get a job. And you're all capable of not having babies before you get married. Just don't put that there right now without that thing on it. Come on. There is no such thing as generalized white privilege or institutional racism. There is just decision privilege. For example, It turns out that the greatest privilege in American society is being born with two parents in the home. And that is true for every single race. It is true regardless of race. The poverty rate among two-parent black families in the United States is 7%. The poverty rate among white single-parent families is 22%. What happened to the white privilege? Why isn't the white single mother richer than the black two-parent family? Well, because single mothers are not richer than two-parent families. End of story. The single greatest predictor of intergenerational poverty in America is single motherhood. White privilege is not responsible for elevated levels of black men getting black women pregnant and leaving. Okay, it is not. And white privilege, by the way, is also not responsible for an increasing number of white men getting white women pregnant and then leaving. There's no white person holding a gun to some dude's head telling him, screw your girlfriend and take off. It's not happening. Okay? How about, here's another privilege. Okay, people are always whining about the white privilege in the criminal justice system. Here's another privilege that I think is more important. It's what I like to call the not committing crimes privilege. Okay, the higher criminality rate in the black community is not the result of some evil white system of skin privilege. It's because individuals are committing crimes. If you don't want to go to jail for murder, I have an easy solution. Don't murder people. Here is the fact about that supposedly evil criminal justice system. It actually under-prosecutes murder in minority communities. You know why? Because minority communities are under-policed. When police do come into contact with black people to take the lying, disgusting Black Lives Matter movement's cause, police are less likely to kill black people than white people in the same circumstances. As early as 1994, the DOJ surveyed felony cases in the country's 75 largest urban areas. You know what they found? Lower felony prosecutions for blacks than whites. A deadly force lab study from Washington State University last year found that participants were biased in favor of black suspects in simulated threat scenarios. In 2015, the DOJ investigated the Philly Police Department for racism. You know what they found? They found white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic police officers to shoot black suspects. Just a few months ago, front page of the New York Times, study from Harvard University, Professor Roland Fryer, he surveyed 1,000 police shootings. He found black suspects are shot less often than white suspects in comparable situation. By the way, Fryer is black. In 2015, the cops shot, here's the total statistic, you ready? In 2015, the cops shot 987 people who died. A huge majority of those were armed or threatening deadly force. Blacks represented 26% of those shot. Blacks also represent in the United States nearly 50% of all murder perpetrators. Police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by the cops. How about the white privilege of stop and frisk? We hear this one all the time, right? The white stop and frisk is super duper racist. Mayor de Blasio, that idiot communist from New York, he thinks that. In New York, the reason why stop and frisk keeps running into minorities is because minorities keep committing crimes. Between January and June 2008, 98% of all gun assailants in the city of New York were black or Hispanic. Stop and frisk targeted 85% black and Hispanic. So statistically, they were discriminating against white people, actually. Right? If there is white privilege, it's in over-policing white communities and under-policing minority communities. Black areas plagued by violent crime don't need fewer cops, they need more cops. And they won't get them, thanks to people like those Black Lives Matter protesters. And more black people will die because...
I just want to disagree with Lauren there. I feel a heavy amount of animosity towards you. But thank you for bringing this ignorance to our campus, because I think it's important when you hear people from different sides. And because of the First Amendment, I can say that, right?
Well, thank you.
But I do have a real question in there.
Your video, because there was no question mark at the end. This was going to be a real downer.
In your video where you debunk white privilege, you talk about how white privilege is a made-up term by privileged minorities. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on some of the privileges that you think minority groups have.
Okay, so in privileges in law, so when I say privilege, I'm actually going to talk about legal standing. Okay, so affirmative action is a privilege. Affirmative action is a privilege. Subprime mortgages designed to appeal to minority recipients without proper qualifications, that is a privilege. Now, those are a couple examples of privilege. Privilege would also be the police being told that they can't police in communities the same way they would in other communities because they don't understand the problems of minority communities. That's a privilege. And by the way, these privileges are not helpful, but these are as an overall matter. But it is certainly it's very difficult for me to see how it's not a privilege to get a lower score on the SAT than the Asian guy who's living in exactly the same circumstance. He gets penalized 50 points. You get 230 points on the SATs. That is definitionally a privilege. So there's one. Do you disagree?
Yeah, but I don't want to take up everyone's time, so I'm just going to let.
Do you think a distinction should be made between mainstream Muslim culture and radical Islamist terrorists?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think that there is a difference between Islam as a religion and radical Islam. However, I think that it is also a mistake to pretend that radical Islam is a tiny minority of Muslims. If you look at the viewpoints by Gallup and Pew polls, worldwide, a large minority of Muslims believe very, very radical things. We don't, not a large majority of American Muslims, by the way, a large majority of Muslims worldwide. A small minority of Muslims in the United States believe super radical things because many of them are westernized. But if you look at Afghanistan, 99% of people in Afghanistan believe in honor killing. Seriously, this was a Pew poll study. If you look at Iraq, it's the same sort of statistic. If you look at Pakistan, there's a huge number of people who back homicide bombings. So, you know, I think that it's a mistake to pretend that the threat is less than it is. I think it's also a mistake to pretend that Islam as a whole does not have a bigger problem with terrorism than other religions, because statistically it obviously does. But obviously, I have no problem. As a guy who prays 3 times a day toward Jerusalem, I have no right to get on somebody's case for praying 5 times a day toward Mecca. I mean, that's silly.